Okay, hi. So let's my panelists come. Sandeep from National Grid. I think Lawrence is living the what we are talking about, city of the future. He's stuck in the traffic. So he will be here soon. And Samir Hamdar is here. He's the professor at George Washington University, so he's local. Uh, and it's a kind of privilege to moderate this panel. Let me start with my introduction and a little background, and then I will go through this. So we are talking about resilience, electrification, and the path to net zero. My name is Navneet Trivedi. I am from New York right now. I have worked for utilities industry for 30 years now. I started, my background is an electrical engineer. I used to do power plant designs, and I went to automation. Then I was a management consultant for 15 years, and then I co-founded this company, which I run for 8 years. And last 8 years were real fun of my life because we were kind of focused on transformation and how to move the needle from current one-way flow of electricity and the grid to make it more distributed. And I got involved early on with New York Rev, as you might have heard. It's a bold vision, but the question is how to implement. So a lot of kind of my work is around helping utilities, regulators, policymakers, technology companies to sort out the issue about how the business model will work. And just kind of brief, apart from working in US, I work in Latin America. Brazil is like one of the country which I worked for last 10 plus years, and we are still kind of working on the projects in Brazil. So that's my kind of background. As far as the panel goes, I think we have an excellent panel here, and Lawrence will join shortly. But you must have heard, like, utilities always exist for, reliability, quality, and affordability. But you never heard that they exist for resiliency. And the reason you didn't hear that because it was not like prominent factor till the climate change took the hold. So the real question is that what do they exist for resiliency or not, and what it means. So just to kind of set the stage here, we are talking about two types of resiliency. One is the grid resiliency, which I think utilities kind of understand. That's what they are working on, grid hardening. They are investing billions of dollars. But then there is a question of customer resiliency. So what it means is, can we keep the lights on when the grid is not there? And as you can see, what we are seeing across this country and many other countries with climate catastrophe, that utilities are not able to keep the lights on with their current grids. So there is definitely a limitation, but there is an opportunity for utilities to play a different role, but that will kind of lead to changing business model of the utilities. And they have to recognize the value which can be provided by distributed resources. That's where the resiliency is required. So we are going to talk about all this thing. And then just to kind of give you a little bit more context on this panel, we talk resiliency means we are saying the lights on, but when we talk about cities of the future, it's just not about electricity and keeping the lights on. The resiliency of the city is like, for example, if there is a snowstorm or anything and city stops, so transportation, like people are suffering because of pollution. I am from Manhattan, I live in Manhattan, and I did a work for Edison, and one of the interesting thing was we plotted the pollution in the 5 boroughs of New York. And if you look at the map of just pollution, Manhattan is the most polluted of the 5 boroughs. But when we superimpose poverty on top of it, we found that it's Bronx, it's parts of Brooklyn, Queen, which is more problem. So there is a real issue in terms of, when we talk of resilient infrastructure, it's not just about electricity and delivery. So this panel, we are going to talk about the biggest polluter sector, the transportation and its impact, and how to make the thing more resilient from kind of multi-dimension. So with that, I will put Sandeep on spot with the same kind of question. You can introduce yourself, but as I said, we all know that utilities exist for reliability, quality, and affordability, but we never heard of resiliency. So you can tell us what you think the role of the utilities in resiliency, and then how National Grid is playing that.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. So my pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone. So a little bit about myself. I am Sandeep Dudhwewala. I'm a VP of Utility of the Future for National Grid in New York. My role and my team's role is to really just make sure we have a clear plan to decarbonize, and we have a roadmap to get to our future state. So my team, myself, we look at the future state, we design what that looks like, and then we plan for it to make sure we are taking steps to get there, near term and long term, making sure we have investments in the pipeline to achieve the outcomes that our states want to achieve, our customers want, and how do we get there. So I'll leave it at that. So to share my thoughts on the question that Navneet brought up. So I think, Navneet, you're right. I think traditionally utilities have been known about delivering affordable, reliable power to customers. Now that has changed with climate change, with threats of terrorism, cyber threats, that has changed. So the traditional reliability measures that usually look at blue sky days, they don't take into account disruptions on the grid. And so utilities are increasingly making sure that the infrastructure is resilient, that it can withstand disruption, major disruptions like storms. The recent storm in Buffalo, we had unforeseen events, like we had substations that froze, had never happened before. So we are increasingly seeing those type of events. So what utilities like National Grid are doing, we are running models to predict, to make sure we understand where do we have the risks, which parts of the network have the highest risk, and how can we proactively make those assets resilient, more resilient. And that comes at a cost, right? So the new paradigm for utility is not just about reliability, it's not just about safety, it's also about resiliency, it's about clean energy, and it's about affordability. And to do all of that is extremely challenging, right? So that's kind of what we have to do, is to figure out how do we balance all those different objectives to optimize value for customers.
Yeah, so I think I just want to hold on for 1 minute, then I go to you. So the question is about resiliency, right? You recognize that resilience is required, but the approach to deliver the resiliency, as I said, are two. Like you can have grid resilient, means I can make my substation more resilient. I can ensure that it works with a snowstorm, and lines kind of, reducing the span of the conductors and all. But other thing is that how to make the customer resilient. And I will come to that with you also, Samir, because when we're talking to customer, what I'm going to is basically, if we want to have a meaningful resilience, we need to enable the customer, and a lot of resources can be with customer.
Yeah.
And then there is a added complexity of decarbonization on top of it. So how, if National Grid is playing any role with the customer behind the meter and using those resources and distributed to kind of make it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a great point, right? So we are looking at how can we enable our customers to be more resilient. It's not just the grid, as you pointed out, but when the grid goes down, can the customers, can they have power from their rooftop solar or whatever power sources do they have? And today, they don't. If the grid goes down, the rooftop solar system doesn't work, right? So how do you make that happen? And what technologies do you need to enable customers to do that? So those are the areas. So we are looking at, we are making investments in technologies to, the role that we play is to enable our customers, make sure the infrastructure is prepared, and that it allows those type of islanding situations where if customers disconnect or if they don't have power, that they can island, and they, if they can sustain a microgrid, that they can do that. And from our perspective, we're also looking at how we can invest in non-wires alternatives, where we can deploy energy storage to help local communities, and to do it in a way that provides grid benefits, but also provides customer benefits in the event of a major event. So we're definitely looking at investments like that. I think the big challenge really comes down to, what cost does it come at? And like, how do you make it happen? And can you do it proactively? Can you make a case, an economic case, and get approval for that. And that's kind of the big challenge that we have to go through.
So since like you're talking about that, I would add more complexity to that. So the one customer class which you don't have right now may come from transportation. Because when we are talking about cities of the future and resilient infrastructure, electrification of transportation plays a bigger role, and it can be both resource and burden on your system. So you are right now dealing with just the customer who are existing, but we have some new customer which you should be excited about, but how you will do it. So somewhere I would like you to kind of, as with your expertise on the electrification and what you see from that perspective.
Again, thank you, and thank you, Navneet, and thank you, Sandeep, for that. So, my name is Samer Hamdar. I'm a professor at the George Washington University, where I direct the transportation program mainly. And I did actually my work started in Europe, and then it moved to Korea. I did some project in Saudi Arabia, and of course in the US, where most of my projects are with the Federal Highway Administration and the US Department of Transportation. Now, knowing that transportation is my core focus, practically we focus a lot on safety and electrification, these two aspects coming together. And I should actually first give two small remarks. The first one is that electrification is already here. In other words, the technology is here. It actually already passed the critical mass, and we are moving into this domain. In the US, we are already past the 6% threshold in terms of vehicle ownership, and by 2030, it will be 50%, and we are moving in that direction across the globe. That's number one. Number two, with that electrification, there are two factors that come very handy. The first one is the fact that with electrification, there will be automation. That's number one. And number two, with electrification, you will have actually additional technologies that will actually impact the behavior of the drivers and the users. Because our customers from the transportation sectors are practically you, meaning the transportation users. And this will entail a big challenge because, number one, it will increase the corresponding power consumption, and it will increase it not only proportionally, because as in every technology, you will have what we call induced demand. And when you have this technology, more people will use the transportation system. And with that, even you'll have a higher surge on the demand for the utility service, especially in terms of the electric grid. And we foresee at least, again, 50% of surge if you are talking about, again, a full electrification on the transportation, on the electric grid. And we expect that the problem to be specifically at night, where you have actually more people going back to their homes and charging their vehicles. And this will entail some problems, especially if you are using solar power. So all these issues render the problem even more complex because our transportation network as is not as resilient. Because the way to handle a city is to think about it in a interdependent socio-technical network. Interdependent socio-technical network. Meaning, my behavior will be impacted, of course, by the demand related to the, again, commercial sector. On top of that, this will impact the demand on the transportation network. The impact on the transportation network will entail a higher demand on the electric network, and with that, even on the communication network, especially moving with connectivity. And having a disruption in one will entail a disruption in other types of networks. So, at this stage, I think the technology is here. The development in terms of the traffic units is here, in terms of electric vehicles, I mean. Let it be buses, trains, personal vehicles, again, scooters, etc., electric bikes also. And the problem is the infrastructure, I think. And the infrastructure as is may not be able to handle this kind of system for the future of our cities without actually having a regulatory framework that is guided by the public sector. And the public sector entails also the involvement of the society and us as communities. Without that, without such framework, with the current system in place, it will be very hard actually to reach full electrification, because we will reach it, but in a resilient and in a equitable manner so that all the populations within a city will benefit equally of these technologies. That's number one. And number two, in terms of resiliency, any kind of surge will not lead to a major disruption. Without the involvement of the public sector and the communities, we don't see it in a very straightforward manner. So this is my take at this stage, in terms of the integration between transportation and electric grids, and in the future in the city network for the future smart cities of the world. Thank you.
So this is the great time, Lawrence, you're late, so now you need to explain about the city of the future, what you experienced on the way. So welcome, actually. We started the panel, we are just kind of, initial remarks, and one point Samir brought about the, we are talking about resiliency, but there is a whole focus on electrification, and he talked on transportation. I was just thinking that all the issues we are laying out are kind of valid, but we are also talking about decarbonization of the buildings and homes and businesses. So that will add even more kind of pressure on the electric infrastructure. So really, the question is, are we dreaming about these things, or these are kind of real, can be achieved? Because we cannot, like current system, we have problem in terms of handling the load and especially resiliency during the weather events. On top of it, we have this need for transportation and electrifying transportation for various reasons. We want to decarbonize, we want to, and the thing is, what Samir brought the point, Lawrence, is that about the regulatory framework and the roles of the utilities and what they should kind of play. So with your background, you're sitting at EAI, how you see these kind of challenges to achieve these from a policy and regulatory point of view. I think we can start from there.
Thank you. First of all, let me apologize for the rain. Didn't create it, and I didn't think it was going to turn out the way it did. So I think my first comment about resilience is build better infrastructure for transportation system. To get me less than 10 minutes from the other side of DC here, it took me almost 25 minutes. So I think, first of all, I work at the Edison Electric Institute, Senior Vice President, and for the international program. So a lot of what I do, is around looking at these issues from a global perspective, not just from the US, but more globally. And I think the question about what's achievable in terms of resilience and electrification to address some of the issues that we're talking about here, I think there are three things that I like to add, not having heard what my previous speakers have said. But I think the first thing around, regulatory issues, I think, right now across the globe, there's a recognition that electrification is going to play a very important part for getting us to where we want to get to in terms of addressing the issues around climate. Now, I think the challenge about it is that the infrastructure that is necessary to be built, both in cities, but bringing electricity into the cities, if you look at some of the mega cities around the world, they already don't have enough space in those cities, right? So it's not a matter of either or in terms of how you electrify. I think you're going to need both large scale power generation as well as decentralized. If you look at some of the cities in the world that I've spent some time the last couple of years, whether it's in India or Africa, even in Latin America, there's just congestion in those cities. And so in terms of bringing large scale renewables, you need to build the infrastructure. And the challenge we have today around the world is people expect electricity without infrastructure. And they have that expectation because for most people, and I always use this as an example, they make the analogy and say, well, why can't we just do what they did in the telecom sector? And I always say that the infrastructure that makes the telecom sector work, for the most part, is invisible because there are satellites up in the space or there are cables in the sea. Well, until we've developed technology where you don't need cables and you don't need physical infrastructure, we need to build physical infrastructure. And I think part of the challenge we're facing in many developed countries today that will kind of slow down the pace of using clean energy is lack of building the infrastructure. Now, if you go to Europe briefly, you've seen the uptick in offshore wind in Europe. you've seen the uptick in renewables in many parts of Europe, North Sea, the UK, what have you. But one of the things that have driven that is because they've built significant amount of grid infrastructure. In the same vein, in other parts of the world, like Australia, where they see high penetration also of solar, they've deployed a lot of technology to enhance the distribution system. So you need both large-scale infrastructure that, to bring large amounts of offshore wind, for example, onshore, but then you also need strong distribution systems to be able to accommodate all of this rooftop or other forms of solar panels or solar technology into the system.
Yeah, I think this is classic kind of thing. I will just a little bit push back on that. So we acknowledge like there's a need to bring clean energy, and you need to kind of deliver. But when in this kind of discussions, when we miss out on the distributed side of the business, like a lot of people think that, oh, I have this backup generator, I have got this battery, I have got this. You talk about building the infrastructure and building from outside, but what about these things? Why we don't utilize? So how you see that, like in terms of, so my belief, I was electrical engineer for 30 years. I used to design big power plants, but of late I realized that we have not done good job of utilizing these resources, because both need to be there, as you said, in the play. So why, like, what you think is the hurdle to kind of make the grid, and what in your perspective that will kind of help or hurt?
I don't see it so much of there being a lot of hurdle or opposition. I think the evolution of a complex system like the electricity system has to be done in a very sort of a purposeful manner, in the sense that it's like flying a plane and repairing the plane, right? You can't just shut the grid down to rebuild it. So I think we need to look at case studies from around the world where people have done what you're saying. They have invested in fixing the distribution systems. But I think for bulk, again, if you're talking about accelerating decarbonization, bringing large amounts of renewables on board, you need a hybrid system. Right. And I think the regulatory challenge, talking about challenge, is that a lot of regulatory systems around the world take an either or proposition, either one or the other. And I think we need both.
I think we all agree here, like, infrastructure is needed, and like the question is how you build that infrastructure. Because infrastructure sucks, we already know, like you were late by 20 minutes because of that. But the point is, the debate in the industry is about like how we going to go and about, because it costs a lot of money to do either way, right? I think one side, the bulk system, we know how to do it. We have been doing for years. We can kind of, figure out. But when we talk about utilizing, we know that by utilizing the resources on distributed side, we can kind of make the difference. And to your point, like electrification of transportation, one of the key thing is that charging infrastructure. That will be required, but it can be what kind of infrastructure? Like you can have just a charger which sucks kind of energy from the grid, or you can have, batteries kind of paired with it, and so that it can do, manage charging or like kind of optimizing the grid. And it's all going to take like, lot of thought as well as money. And I think I want to divvy because of the time because we cannot go from DC without talking about money, which is coming from IRA and IIJ. So it looks like that at least from a government point of view, intent is they are making available these kind of money. But we also know that the needs are so huge that this is like a drop in the bucket kind of thing. So the question is, to develop this whole infrastructure, let's start from the utility perspective, like, what you see the investment requirements and how you think that that can be enabled, and then what is preventing you from doing that. And then I think we go from there and like, talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think just to put it in perspective, so if you just look at New York, and I think Samir, you pointed out as well, with electrification of transportation itself and like renewable energy, and the load is actually going to double in the next 15, 20 years. So now imagine a grid that's been around for decades. It's an aging grid, already in need of modernization and repairs. And on top of that, if you add the doubling of the load, there's a huge investment need in the industry. And I'm just talking, just New York right now, but if you look at it across the country, there's a significant need for investments. So utilities like us, National Grid, we are looking at how can we optimize the cost, because obviously you don't want to just throw money and just build the infrastructure just for the sake of it, right? How do you optimize? Because at the end of the day, our customers have to pay for it. And we already realize with energy bills going through the roof, like even just this season, our customers have seen significant increase in energy bills. They can't afford it. Customers just cannot afford it. So how do we make it affordable? How do we make it equitable? That's a big challenge. And like there are, policies today that disproportionately, harm customers who don't benefit from those policies. So how do you make it? How do you make those policies work in a way that it doesn't disadvantage communities who don't benefit from those policies? And so those are regulatory and policy changes that are needed, and new ways of thinking about how, where do you get the money from? How do you invest? Like, is it partnerships? Is it government funding? Is it other ways of reducing the impact on customers? And one thing I'll just point out, in case of transportation, something that came to mind is, so National Grid is looking at how do we enable highway charging infrastructure from Boston to Buffalo? Because we serve customers in Massachusetts and we serve customers in New York, and we have our transmission corridor across those two states. How do we do that? And now we see the need, and we see by doing it, we would enable electrification of transportation. Like highway drivers would love to be able to charge on that corridor, but it would come at a cost. And we need to make anticipatory investments. So we need to make a case to regulators that we should do that. It's like build it before the load is there. So, just almost like making a case that load will come, but we need to build for it now. And to avoid the challenges that we run into, where if you don't do that, you have long delays in interconnection time. Like just we are seeing with rooftop solar. If the grid is not ready, and if a customer is looking to interconnect, it takes a long time to interconnect that. So we can prevent that by being more proactive, but how do you change the regulatory paradigm to make it happen? And that's a big challenge too.
I'll come back to you at the end, like what you recommend, because maybe there are people who can go to the regulator and say something. But Samir, we talked about two things here. One is about the massive investment requirement, and then the equity, because how it can be like everybody get benefit, not like, some. So how you see that?
So just from my perspective, you have the generation, you have the distribution, and you have the point of access. Frankly, point of access, I don't think there will be a problem in that. We can actually produce, and there are many companies dealing with this issue, where you have, again, different technologies to increase the speed of charging, among other features. So I think this should be fine in terms of, again, development by following the market trends. However, in terms of generation and distribution, I think this is where the key issue is. And from my perspective, again, electricity, it became practically so evident to everyone that they, again, don't understand how privileged we are in order to have access to such, again, amenity in a 24-hour manner, in a very, again, sustainable manner. The main issue, however, is, until now, as Sandeep said, it is, again, utility companies who actually also, they need to be careful about the cost and the corresponding return and the viability of the corresponding system in terms of economic viability. Transportation was not. Transportation from the beginning, when it started, it was a huge investment by the US Department of Transportation, starting with, of course, our interstate system. And it started as such, and it continued to be as such until recently, where now we are privatizing the system. The electric system is actually the opposite. So we start with a private system in a way, and now we are trying to find a way to have a regulatory framework by possibly the Department of Energy in order to encourage utility companies to invest in the electric grid system so that you have, number one, more affordable and more equitable access to such, again, amenity, while taking into consideration the transportation, again, sector among other sectors. So I think to resolve that, I really think that there should be a regulatory framework in order to encourage utility companies to invest in the infrastructure so that, again, to have a more equitable access to such amenity. Now, to do that, again, there are different procedures to do that. There are different, again, possibilities. One possibility is even the electric consumption, knowing the type of point of access, practically you can actually charge it depending on its use. So there are different technological advancements that allows us to actually, even the electricity as an amenity, you can utilize it so that to optimize a use versus the other, or to encourage some type of behavior, because also there's a behavioral component associated with the cities and the users of such amenity. So these are my thoughts on the matter.
So Lawrence, I will kind of summarize and ask you again a loaded question here, because what
Also get all the loaded questions.
because you came late.
I know.
Yeah. So what we are hearing is that there is a need for massive investment, and it should be like good news for utility. The load is going to double and all. But when it comes to like solutions, as Samir said, one is that in highways we spend like as a national kind of mission, like U.S. government did all the highways and built kind of thing. So that's like one way of doing it. Like in that kind of regard, IRA and all these things are like down payments. The other is the encourage the regulation, which can utilities can do it, or there can be something where utilities can play a bigger role. For example, I always felt, this is my personal opinion, since we started, like utilities are told not to own storage, not to own solar, not to kind of, and I get it, like, we want competitive and all those things, but like when we were like at, 100 megawatt of storage, that you have large kind of market to go. So, and there are specific locations where utilities could have put the storage very early on and it could have kind of propelled the thing, but we didn't let that happen because we were like, oh, you cannot do it, So looking at all this thing with your international experience and representing utilities, what do you think should be the model like to enable this infrastructure investments we need?
Actually, it wasn't a loaded question. It was an easy question. Because there's no one size fit all. If you look around the world, there are many countries that are doing different things, headed to the same direction but taking different approaches, right? Even if you go to the UK, where Sandeep company is headquartered, National Grid, even in the UK, the approach by National Grid does not necessarily match the approach of, say, Scottish Southern Energy. So I think what is great to know is that across the world, most electric companies are headed in the right direction in terms of they're on to the clean energy transition. They're making different investments. They're working with their regulators. I think there's one element in this conversation that I want to come back to that Sandeep was on, is the issue of affordability. If there's anything electric companies really focus on, is making sure that the service they deliver is affordable. And to some extent, and Sandeep can either agree or disagree, I sometimes think the utilities are too nice sometimes because they will fight to try to make sure that reliability is number one, followed by affordability. So as we talk about even the transportation issue, one of the feedback I got when I was in Australia a couple of, about 2 years ago, talking about transportation, this person said, look, half of the people living in my town cannot afford to buy even a normal car. If I build all these EV chargers today, it will only benefit one class of my customer. And that class are those who are well off. And so the trade-off that I think we have to make when it comes to these sort of a public infrastructure is the utilities are already doing a lot on their side. I think the regulatory frameworks have to also be matched with the right incentives. If you talk about the IRA several times, well, most people don't realize IRA also involves utility making investment. It's not just, it's a public-private partnership, right? It's not just, Then the last element of this that I think we sometimes forget is the supply chain from a human perspective. Because most utilities around the world today are facing the exodus of retired engineers. You're now going to redesign the physical system, but most people don't realize, say in the US, for example, and other OECD countries, engineering is not as attractive as it used to be. So we can make all the changes and talk about this stuff, but are we investing in the people, in the skills? That's why I wanted to be on this panel because it's at a university. What are universities doing to create the workforce to do what Sandeep would like to do? I don't know about him, but many other utilities around the world, they don't have enough protection engineers. They don't have enough engineers to do grounding. All of those very, very boring things are the things that keep the lights on. And unfortunately, we sometimes forget and say, oh, just put in a bunch of EV chargers. Well, I need distribution system engineers to be able to analyze where there's a fault in the system. Well, I don't have enough distribution system engineers. So what do I do? And I think I've said this in other countries as well. This is where everybody forget. You cannot transition the energy system if you don't have human beings. You cannot.
I was
I tend to silence the moderator.
yeah. That's what EI does, right? So we just kind of went in a very important but different topic. Somebody asked me in a conference in Colombia, like we have this problem of people, engineers, and like we need this, young engineers with like young people with tattoos and all. And my answer to that was, age is a number. Your engineers at 40 and 50, get them tattoos and let them work more on these things. So that is a discussion of, I think, the next panel when we all meet together. But for now, I think, Sandeep, I just put you in kind of spot, and then we will open for one or two questions. So we heard that, utilities have huge opportunity, they want to do it, but what you need, like, to do the investment, right? Like what, like couple of things you would say that, okay, I want to make the grid resilience, I want to support electrification, but here is what I need as a utility from, regulators or policymakers.
Yeah, I think a lot of things have been talked about. I completely agree with Lawrence. Like I was on a call this morning and as if I heard the same exact thing this morning that you just mentioned, that we need resources. We need to make sure we have the human resources to be able to deliver the significant, investments that we need to make. We talked about, policy changes and like how those would enable utilities to invest. One thing I'm optimistic about is technology, right? So I think if you look at and like National Grid as an example, we are looking at various ways to reduce costs for customers. How can we use digital technologies to reduce cost, operational costs, construction costs? How can we leverage digital twins? We talked about that this morning. How do we use that to improve resiliency for the infrastructure? Dynamic load control. So that allows us to get the maximum out of our existing infrastructure without building even more power lines. So how can we do things like that? Energy storage. And just one more thing I'll add to that list is on the building electrification side, not all buildings can be electrified easily. So how do you optimize that? How do you do it in a way that's affordable and cost effective for customers, keeping all options open, keeping all technology options open, and whether it's network geothermal, whether it's renewable natural gas, hydrogen, where it makes sense. How can you do that in a way that you electrify, but you also keep other technology options on the table? So I'm optimistic that the technology is there, but what's needed is to just have those regulatory and policy enablers in place for utilities to be able to do all that.
Samir, any thoughts like last on this one?
No, I just say many people talking about the efficiency of, again, the network and how you can reduce costs or reduce consumption. So one last thought about, we know, for example, we have everything in terms of combustion engines is measured by, again, gallons per mile in terms of fuel consumption, correct? But we have the same thing possibly for electric vehicles. So you have with these electric vehicles, you need also have, again, a measure on their efficiency. So we talk about the battery lifeline, but the battery lifeline is also an important aspect related to that is how many miles per, again, kilowatt among other features on that. And this in itself might either increase energy consumption or might decrease it. So there are many regulations that already exist, for example, for standard utilities. I'm talking about, again, utility units like fridges, like televisions. But for vehicles, we have that for standard combustion engines. But yet we are not there to actually find the best standards for electric vehicles. And this is also something related to the standardization and the regulatory framework and a possible source of support for utility vehicles in order for us to have a more resilient electrification for our future cities.
Lawrence, any last thoughts on?
No, I think I would just add one point back to what Sandeep said. I think in addition to the issue around human resource, right, which I think is extremely important, I think the conversation about the complexity of keeping the lights on is something we need to have, because we have trivialized electrification to a switch. But what happens behind that switch is often only brought to the forefront when there's a major storm or when there's a hurricane or when something like that happens and we have a major disruption. And so I think even in a nice normal day like this, people need to understand what goes on behind the scenes to make that light glow when you hit that switch. I think if people appreciate that, and we as engineers, myself, we've done a poor job in explaining to people, because everyone says, oh, Lawrence, nobody wants to talk about this complex thing called reactive power. Sorry for that. But you have to talk about the complexity because it is a complex field. And the last thing I would say, one thing that never gets credited, when the lights go off, so EI has this thing called mutual assistance, and Sandeep knows this, where you fly crews from all over the country. The risk these men and women put their lives on the line to keep the lights on is something that oftentimes people just take for granted. And I think we need to start, when we talk about resilience, we need to say the workforce that keeps the lights on, we need to spend more time on focusing on what it is that they do.
Right. Yeah, as you can see that this 45 minutes is not enough to talk about these massive issues of infrastructure, regulation, policies, but I think the intent is clear, as you see from utilities, the association representing the technology, gurus, that we have all the ingredients, everybody had good intention, but how to make it work. In my personal view, I think we are struggling with the business model creation around these things, which can be profitable or at least attractive to everybody. So that's the kind of debate we need to have and then come up with those models and then look at what policies and regulation can do. But I want to thank you all, but I want to open up if there is one or two questions. We are out of the time, but yeah, still.
Yeah, I'll take the one from the back real quick.
Hey, thank you. So as primarily a multimodal bike and transit traveler, here's my helmet right here. And to pick up on Lawrence's and an earlier speaker, Hala Boulaz, I believe her name was, about the sort of premature and inequitable infrastructure build out. Please speak more to the interactive, the more sustainable alternatives to personal vehicles. I don't think we heard too much on that.
So I'm also a cyclist, so I come from. The main thing is, alternative transportation are mostly micromobility systems, and especially if you are talking about non-motorized transportation, of course, will play their role, especially in the cities of the future with mixed land use among different planning mechanisms. And that's actually, I teach sustainable urban planning at UW, so we teach this interaction between the two aspects, land use and transportation demand, and how to make the system much more efficient in terms of sustainability, in terms either of environmental emissions, among environmental issues, among other issues. The main thing is also to keep in mind that micromobility and non-motorized transportation can actually serve well the demand, but cannot serve all of the demand, even not most of the demand. So I think from an intermodal transportation system, practically what we need to do is actually favor transit systems. That's number one. And in terms of the first and last mile, that becomes a major issue. That's where micromobility plays a role. But even for those who cannot have actually access to such service, either possibly due to some socioeconomic characteristics like age, health issues, among other issues, you need to provide the alternative in terms of shared mobility services. So the interaction, of course, of these from a sustainability perspective is clear. So personal vehicle will have a lesser and lesser role, and the focus will be on transit systems with first and last mile services. That's mainly it. The problem, however, is the infrastructure. Now we're talking about transportation infrastructure is not equipped for that. And the way, for example, our interstate systems are developed and the way even the coverage of our transit system is set is not ready for that in terms of coverage, and thus bring the issue of reliability and accessibility to such transit systems. So the solution is clear. We know how to reach for that, but the infrastructure also is not ready, let alone now adding the electric aspect to that, and this will make it even more complex. So this is my thought on the topic.
Can I just add one comment to broaden this conversation? So if you've ever been to India or parts of Nigeria and you think about multimodal transportation, you will see it on steroids, right? One of the things that I find so fascinating about India, parts of China, Africa, and other parts of, even parts of the US now, is the fact that e-mobility is getting to e-bikes, right? And what that is going to do is one of those things that you really don't talk about, but think about, say, 200 million people in Africa commuting around the villages, all needing an electric bike, right? Well, you may say, well, Lawrence, why don't you just charge those bikes? Well, it's not that simple because, you don't have, it's not just a single charge, right? So I think the real e-revolution when it comes to transportation, we will learn a lot more from the developing world that have to deal with it because they don't have the infrastructure. So they have to build new infrastructure. And that's one place I will point to get some lessons. It's always difficult when you have a established framework. It's more difficult to break it down as opposed to when you started from scratch. So I'll look to the developing world and see what they do when it comes to things like your question on multimodal transportation systems.
Anyone else?
We actually are out of time, so we have a networking reception happening right upstairs. If we can continue this conversation up there,
Okay.
But we'll be talking about transportation right in the morning tomorrow at 9 a.m. as well, so we can continue it then at 2. So with that, we do actually have to be out of this room. So I would like to thank our panelists for the session today.
Thank you.